Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the shadowed corners of Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries, an age shrouded in incense and fear, where belief ruled over doubt and silence was safer than truth. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift through the damp alleyways of medieval villages, over windswept moors, and into the heart of torchlit chambers, where judgment was passed not by proof, but by faith and suspicion. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle, historical journeys, and if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Perhaps you are listening in the quiet of night, your body wrapped in stillness, while your thoughts linger in unrest. Perhaps the weight of modern exhaustion, of long days, unspoken sadness, or the hollow ache of solitude has brought you here to rest in history's hush. That is more than welcome. This story is for you. Let us begin in the silence before the fire. The sky above early modern Europe is dark with more than just nightfall. In towns small and vast, a strange kind of tension pulses like a heartbeat beneath cobbled streets. Whispers cling to doorways, shadows lengthen before their time, and the crackling of distant wood sometimes signals more than just warmth. This is a time when the world believed itself surrounded by evil, an evil not abstract or philosophical, but personal, human-shaped, and female more often than not. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe was engulfed by a fervor of religious authority and supernatural dread. The Catholic Church, threatened by internal reforms and shifting powers, tightened its grip on souls through the might of the Holy Inquisition. Heresy, deviation, dissent, each became a whispered accusation capable of consuming a life. And from this cauldron of fear, the figure of the witch emerged. Not just the healer with too much knowledge, or the widow who walked alone, but any woman or man who lived outside the fragile bounds of conformity. It was in this crucible of suspicion and fire that a certain kind of man rose to prominence, the witch hunter. To many, he was a savior. To others, an ominous presence, cloaked not just in robes and authority, but in something far darker, conviction. He was not merely an enforcer, but a believer, a man raised in a world where evil was not a metaphor but a living force. He saw himself not as a tormentor, but as a purifier, not as a monster, but as a servant of divine justice. And yet behind that certainty lay a deeper turmoil, one not often seen in dusty archives or bold illustrations. For what kind of man volunteers to stare into the eyes of the accused, to bind their hands, to press their flesh, to wait for screams? What dreams haunted him after the fire dimmed? What silences followed him home? This is the story of one such man, not a famous name carved into the annals of power, but an ordinary soul shaped by extraordinary violence. Through him, we will walk the long road from faith to fear, from obedience to doubt. We will explore not only the rituals and doctrines that sanction such cruelty, but the quiet humanity buried beneath them. We will listen carefully to the cracking wood of the pyre and to the silence that comes before it. Close your eyes if you'd like. Imagine the distant tolling of a church bell, the cold stone beneath your feet, the smoky tang of incense hanging in the air. Our tale begins not in fire, but in shadow, at the precise moment when one man hears a call that will change his life forever. He will become a hunter, not of beasts, not of criminals, but of witches. And as we trace the shape of his days and the weight of his nights, we may find not only a reflection of a distant world, but a mirror too, for parts of ourselves we rarely name. You are not alone. Many in many times have felt what you feel now. Let us begin. The wind that stirs through the village at dawn carries with it more than chill. It is laced with whispers, suspicions, and the faint rustle of parchment, letters, edicts, and now and then accusations. The man we follow has not always walked in robes. Once he was a boy like many others. He ran between stone walls with muddy feet and wide eyes, obedient to his mother's rosary prayers, fearful of the devil spoken of by priests with sun-worn faces. He watched as neighbors were shunned. He listened as women were warned not to speak too boldly, not to walk too freely, not to think too much. He was taught, not through cruelty, but through care, that righteousness is narrow and that danger wears familiar faces. He is older now, shaped by a time of unraveling certainties. The Europe around him groans under the weight of change. The Protestant Reformation has cracked open ancient dogmas. The printing press spills knowledge like blood. Peasants rebel. Monarchs shift. And through it all, the Church, wounded, threatened, but still immensely powerful, tightens its grip. It is within this storm of change that the Inquisition extends its reach. Heresy must be identified, purity must be preserved, order must be restored. But in quiet corners, another terror begins to rise, the belief that Satan's servants walk among the people. That witches, real malignant beings in league with the devil, are to blame for failed crops, for stillborn children, for the inexplicable sadness that descends like fog. For the Inquisition to succeed in this new battlefield, it needs eyes, hands, conviction. It needs men who are willing to go where others fear. Not priests alone, but civilians, chosen or self-appointed, burning with holy purpose. Our man is such a one. What drives him to accept the role? A part of it is faith, of course. He has been raised in a world where the church is not merely a place of worship, but the very architecture of life and death. Heaven and hell are not metaphors. They are destinations, shaped by obedience. To serve the Inquisition is to serve the divine. But there is more. There is hunger. Hunger for order, for clarity, for righteousness, in a world that no longer makes sense. There is fear, too. The fear that he may fail in the eyes of God, or that evil may consume the innocent if he does nothing. And there is ambition, quiet and unnamed, the kind that festers in places where poverty meets piety. To be chosen by the church is to be elevated. To be trusted with the pursuit of witches is to become both feared and respected. In 1484, the path is made clearer. Pope Innocent VIII issues the Bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. In it, he confirms the existence of witches and grants inquisitors the authority to pursue them without impediment. This decree is not merely ink on vellum, it is a divine green light, a seal that transforms suspicion into duty. The man reads the words slowly, aloud, in candlelight. The flame dances, shadows flicker across the stone walls. He feels the weight of the parchment in his hands, and something inside him stirs. A calling, a certainty. He is no longer merely a servant of the church. He is now a soldier of faith, a protector of souls, a weapon forged by doctrine. He begins to travel, to towns where the air is thick with silence, where eyes avert and rumors crawl like insects. He listens, he learns, he watches. Each village has its story. A cow that stopped giving milk, a girl who cried out in her sleep, a child who vanished. Each tale, when told in fear, becomes a spark, and he carries the tinder. He will ask the questions. He will find the signs. He will uncover the truth. Or so he believes. And so, under gray skies and among trembling voices, begins the long and winding road of the witch hunter. With every step he moves further from the boy who once feared the dark and deeper into it. His journey is just beginning. The air within the cloistered chamber is heavy with the scent of wax and old parchment. Candlelight pools and golden puddles across the wooden table, illuminating the spine of a thick, time-worn book bound in cracked leather. He opens it with reverence, as one might open a sacred relic. The pages creak slightly, their script dense and unwavering. This is no mere collection of ideas. It is scripture for his vocation. The book is titled Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. First published in 1487 by the Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this manual does not read as a question, but as a declaration. Witches exist. They consort with the devil. They must be rooted out. And here, in ink, both meticulous and merciless are the ways to do so. He traces the words slowly, letting them settle in his mind. Each page offers certainty, structure, a kind of cruel clarity. The world outside may be chaotic, full of shifting alliances, strange illnesses, and unexplained griefs. But within these pages, every misfortune has a cause. Every question has an answer. Evil has a name, a face, and a pattern. The Malleus is divided into parts. The first defends the reality of witchcraft and the legitimacy of prosecuting it. The second explains how witches practice their malice, how they steal fertility from the soil, summon storms, and seduce men into ruin. The third part details how to identify, question, and punish them. It is a handbook, not of law, but of theology draped in the illusion of investigation. For the man who now calls himself a witch hunter, this book is both map and mirror. It confirms his fears, echoes his convictions, and justifies his actions. He begins to see signs where before he saw strangeness. He learns to read the world not through compassion, but through suspicion. A healing woman who knows too much of herbs. A midwife whose births often end in stillness. A child who stares too long into the fire. All are suddenly readable through the lens of the Malleus. What unsettles most, however, though he does not yet admit it, not even to himself, is the book's deep contempt for women. Over and over, it describes the female as weak, deceptive, and spiritually dangerous. It speaks of their supposed carnal nature, their tendency to envy, their insatiable hunger for power, cloaked in sensuality. To be born a woman, the book implies, is to be dangerously close to damnation. And yet, he does not question it. Not now. The doctrine has given him a purpose. It is easier to believe the words are true than to unravel the comfort they bring. Certainty is soothing, even when it leads to fire. The Malleus becomes his constant companion. It is consulted before each journey, quoted in sermons, held aloft in courtrooms. Its pages, once clean, are now smudged with ash and oil. Its corners curl from frequent use. And though it speaks of salvation, it does so in a voice that never whispers, only commands. There are times, however, in the quiet after the day's work is done, when he feels a subtle, creeping unease. It comes not as a voice, but as an absence, an emptiness where once there was empathy. He ignores it as one might ignore a distant cough in a silent room. Instead, he focuses on the steps laid out in the manual. Identify, isolate, interrogate, punish. Each procedure is justified, each act sanctified. The fire that consumes is holy. The screams are not proof of guilt or innocence, but simply necessary sounds on the path to purification. Outside the monastery walls, the wind carries the cries of owls and the rustle of dry leaves. Inside, the hunter prepares. The Malleus Maleficarum lies open before him. Tomorrow, he will travel to a village where the crops have failed. Rumors speak of a crone who curses men with her eyes. He will listen. He will observe. He will apply what he has learned. And slowly, steadily, the pages of the manual will turn into footsteps. The hunt deepens. Dawn arrives like a whisper, pale and uncertain, filtering through the narrow stained glass windows of the chapel. The stone beneath his knees is cold, but he does not shift. The hunter kneels in silence, his head bowed, hands clasped so tightly they pale. He is not yet a man of action this morning, not yet the interrogator, not yet the judge. For now he is simply a vessel, waiting to be filled with purpose. This is the ritual before the hunt. Long before he steps into a village or approaches a suspect, there is this inner preparation, this solemn alignment of his spirit with what he has been told is the will of God. He has learned that one must be clean to confront evil, not only in body, but in soul. To face witches is to risk contamination. One must first be fortified. He begins with fasting. Bread alone, sometimes none at all. The emptiness of his stomach is intentional, a hollowing out, a gesture of submission. Hunger sharpens his senses. It focuses his mind. It reminds him that the flesh is weak and that his work must rise above the cravings of the body. Then comes prayer, not a soft murmur, but long recitations, sometimes lasting hours, filled with verses of exorcism, pleas for clarity, and desperate appeals to St. Michael the Archangel. Protect me, shield me. Give me strength to see what others cannot. He repeats these words until they no longer feel spoken but embedded, woven into his breath, into the rhythm of his heart. Sometimes he carries with him a relic, bone splinters of saints pressed into worn leather pouches and hung around his neck. They are not ornaments, but shields. He believes, as do those who trained him, that relics hold power and that the devil recoils from their presence. A crucifix, always. Holy water, blessed salt. He sprinkles these not just in the homes he inspects, but also upon himself, as though sealing his flesh from corruption. He cleans his tools, not weapons, not yet, but instruments of inquiry, quills, scrolls of parchment for recording confessions, oil for the lamp that will burn long into the night. Every action is deliberate, and in every gesture there is an echo of fear of facing something that may not be human, something cunning, ancient, unseen. And finally, there is solitude. Before he leaves, he sits alone in the cloisters. No one speaks. No one disturbs him. The silence is not empty. It is thick, almost sacred. In it he listens for signs, not voices, but signs. A change in the light, a flicker of shadow, a memory rising unbidden. These, he has been taught, are messages, warnings, permissions. He does not speak of doubt. He cannot. To admit uncertainty is to let the devil find purchase, and so even if he trembles, he prays louder. Even if he hesitates, he moves forward. Because faith, he has learned, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite it. The community expects his arrival with reverence and unease. Children are told not to stare. Women avert their eyes. Men offer lodging, firewood, silence. No one wishes to be remembered too clearly by the hunter. His presence alone is enough to summon unearthed memories, hidden sins, old wounds. He steps into these villages robed not just in fabric, but in belief. His breath carries scripture, his gaze carries judgment, and yet beneath all the ritual, beneath the protections and prayers, he remains a man, with lungs that ache in cold air, with fingers that tremble before each confrontation, with eyes that sometimes close, too long, remembering faces. These rituals are armor, and like all armor, they are worn to conceal the vulnerable flesh beneath. Tomorrow he will begin again. Another town, another whisper, another name. But tonight, he prays, he fasts, he listens, he waits. The village he enters this time is quiet, too quiet. There is no laughter in the streets, no hammering from the smithy, no bread sellers calling their wares. The people nod to him, but their eyes shift away. A goat bleats behind a fence. Smoke rises from chimneys, but the scent of burning wood is somehow dulled, as though the very air resists warmth. This is the silence of fear. And in that silence, the witch hunter begins his work. He does not begin with accusations. He listens first. He walks among the homes, his gaze steady, his steps unhurried. He speaks with the parish priest, who is always the first to offer a list. Unofficial, whispered, incomplete. Then come the widows, the wives of men who travel, the young girls with wide eyes and tight braids. One speaks of a neighbor who tends to cats, another of a girl whose mother died screaming. The hunter does not react. He only notes. There is a method to this, shaped by the malleus and honed through practice. Witches leave signs, it is believed, subtle but unmistakable to those trained to see. A birthmark on the back, a mole that doesn't bleed when pricked, eyes that meet too boldly, a voice that sings in the dark, herbs growing too abundantly near a door, a sudden illness with no explanation. These, to the hunter, are not coincidences. They are patterns, evidence. Clues left behind by those who consort with the devil. He watches as fear does his work for him. It is not always he who accuses. Often it is the community itself. A farmer blames the old woman who cursed his soil after a dispute. A midwife is whispered about because a child she delivered never cried. Neighbors recall a strange light in the forest near one house, or the way a certain girl always seems to know who will fall sick next. One suspicion births another, and soon names are falling like snow. The hunter compiles them in a leather-bound notebook, each one accompanied by observations, facts and impressions blurred into a single narrative. He rarely finds resistance. Those who speak feel protected by his presence. Those who remain silent feel exposed. The fear is communal, contagious, and beneath it all lies a terrible uncertainty. Because sometimes even the hunter wonders, what if the signs are not signs? What if the witch is merely a lonely woman or a child who dreams too vividly? What if the evil they seek is not in the accused, but in the eye of the accuser? But such thoughts must be pushed away. He cannot afford doubt, not now. The malleus taught him that Satan is cunning. He can wear innocence like a mask. He can twist kindness into a spell. The devil, they say, is not easily recognized unless one knows where to look. So he looks. He calls women to be examined. He speaks with their neighbors, their families. He watches their gestures. He listens for hesitation, for contradiction. He notes every injury, every stillbirth, every spoiled jar of preserves. He draws connections where others see only chance. He walks the village like a shadow, gathering not proof but patterns. And once he feels the net is drawn tight enough, he speaks. He names her. The accused is almost always someone already marked by difference. A woman who speaks too freely, a girl who refuses a man's advances, a healer whose tinctures work too well. Their crime is often simply existing outside the bounds of what is acceptable. And once named, their world unravels. Doors close, friends disappear, stones appear in the paths they walk. The hunter sees all this and does not interfere. He tells himself it is the community's instinct for survival. That it is evidence that he was right. He does not yet see the cycle. He does not yet hear the echo of his own silence. But the signs are everywhere now. The village speaks in half sentences and glances. The air feels heavier. The accused woman no longer leaves her home. Children draw crude symbols in the dust when they pass her gate. Dogs bark at her door. The hunter returns to his room and sharpens his quill. The time for observation is ending. The time for questioning is near. Night falls over the village like a shroud, and with it comes the stillness of dread. Within the stone walls of the modest tribunal chamber, the air is cold despite the flickering torchlight. Shadows cling to the corners, and every sound, every step, every breath seems amplified in the hush. The accused is brought in with quiet ceremony. Her hands are bound, not roughly, but firmly, as though to remind her, and all present, that she is no longer a neighbor, a healer, a woman, but something other. A suspect, a vessel of darkness to be emptied. The hunter stands behind a heavy wooden table, the tools of his inquiry laid out before him: a quill, a parchment, a crucifix, a small vial of holy water. Behind him, a priest murmurs a prayer under his breath, asking for divine clarity. This is not, the hunter reminds himself, an act of cruelty. It is an act of cleansing, a necessary step in the path to redemption for the accused, for the village, for the soul of Christendom itself. He begins not with threats, but with questions, simple ones: her name, her lineage, her trade, her habits. He observes her eyes, her posture, her hesitations. Any slip, any stutter becomes meaningful. He asks about herbs she keeps, about dreams she has had, about whether animals behave strangely around her. He listens not only to what is said, but to what is not. Silence in this room is as heavy as confession. But if her answers are too smooth, too practiced, this too is suspicious. The hunter has been trained to see every path as leading toward guilt. If she cries, it may be the devil resisting exposure. If she is calm, it may be the devil masking his agent. If she prays, it may be mockery. If she curses, it is proof. And when answers no longer suffice, the instruments are brought forth. They lie beneath a cloth hidden until needed. The potro, stretching rack. The pair of anguish, inserted into the mouth to tear from within. The strappado, where hands are bound behind the back and the body is dropped, dislocating joints with a sickening pull. These are not punishments, not yet. These are tools to find the truth. Or so he has been taught. The woman begs, she sobs, she insists on her innocence. Her voice trembles, then rises, then falters into hoarse silence. But innocence is a slippery word here. It holds no power without confession. And confession is the key that opens the door to salvation. The hunter does not revel in this. He does not smile. He does not shout. He instructs calmly, his voice steady. He watches her face for the moment of collapse, the flicker when resistance becomes surrender. It always comes, whether through pain, through exhaustion, through despair. It comes. And when it does, the words spill like blood. Yes, she has seen the devil in dreams. Yes, she has met in the forest. Yes, she has used herbs to curse a neighbor's cow. Yes, she has flown, danced, whispered secrets to the wind. She confesses not because it is true, but because it is the only way the agony stops. And in her confession, the hunter finds his proof. He does not see that the questions guided the answers. He does not hear the echo of his own fear in her voice. Instead, he writes it all down, his quill scratching across the parchment like the wind through dry leaves. Her words are catalogued, signed, sealed. They will be read aloud before the council. They will be used to justify what comes next. She is no longer a question. She is an answer. And the hunter in his heart feels both victory and a strange, deep quiet. The room is empty again. The tools are cleaned, the parchment dried. The woman is taken back to her cell, her silence heavier now than her screams. And the hunter remains, alone, beside the dying flame, wondering, briefly, if he has brought truth into the world or simply pressed it into shape. Tomorrow, the confession will be read, and the fire will begin its preparation. The night after the confession is never restful. Though the hunter returns to his quarters, though he performs his prayers and closes his eyes in obedience to the rituals of stillness, sleep hovers just beyond reach. When it does come, it arrives in fragments, images of twisted limbs, voices blurred by pain, words that echo with too much desperation to be forgotten. He wakes before dawn, heart pounding, throat dry. He tells himself this is the burden of the righteous. The woman has confessed. This should bring closure. But instead her words replay in his thoughts. He remembers the tremor in her hands, the unnatural way her eyes rolled back when the cords pulled too tight. He remembers that she spoke only after the third turn of the rope, and even then, her voice was scattered, as though she were searching for what she thought he wanted to hear. Still, the confession stands. Ink on parchment, witnessed. Verified, irrefutable. But he knows, somewhere beneath the armor of his vocation, that something is not right. He begins to notice a pattern, not just in this village, but in those that came before. The confessions often share details too similar, too rehearsed. The flight through the night sky, the Sabbath in the woods, the goat that spoke in riddles. They come not like memories, but like recitations. As though they had been passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by fear, burnished by suffering, until they no longer belong to the accused at all. And there is more. He has heard children confess to having cursed the weather. He has watched a blind woman insist that she saw Satan in the shape of a crow. He has written down words from mouths so swollen they could barely speak, and yet each of these confessions was accepted, ratified, and used to damn not only the individual but others as well. Because a confession is never a solitary thing, it is a thread, one that pulls more names into the light. Under the weight of torture, or even the mere threat of it, the accused name others, neighbors, midwives, friends. Sometimes they name those who are already dead. Sometimes they invent names altogether. But always the net widens. It is a cycle the hunter has come to recognize. Suspicion leads to interrogation. Interrogation leads to pain. Pain leads to confession. Confession leads to more suspicion, and so it continues, each step justified, each step irreversible. And within it all the hunter's role shifts. He is no longer merely an observer or even an investigator. He becomes an architect of belief. His expectations shape the questions. His questions shape the answers. His answers become doctrine, but still he cannot stop. To stop is to question not just the process, but the foundations upon which it rests, the church, the doctrine. The words of men long dead, inscribed in sacred texts. To doubt the justice of this system is to doubt God himself, and that is a path darker and lonelier than any he dares tread. So he continues, he sharpens his quill. He records what is said, even when it trembles with implausibility. He writes the names, he signs the parchment. But at night, the silence presses harder. The fire crackles more loudly in his imagination. And the truth, fragile, fractured, buried beneath layers of ritual and duty, whispers from the margins of every confession. Perhaps she believed what she said. Perhaps she did not. Perhaps he has built a life not upon justice, but upon need, his need to believe, to serve, to matter. Tomorrow he will oversee the sentence, but tonight he hears not the words she confessed, but the cry behind them, a cry that did not seek forgiveness, only mercy. The morning is damp. A thin mist hangs over the village square, softening the outlines of homes and trees, but doing little to hide the structure at its center. A scaffold, newly assembled, stands like a skeletal altar, its purpose unspoken, yet unmistakably understood. Around it, villagers gather in silence, their feet shuffling against the earth, their breaths visible in the cold. It is here, in this open space, that the execution will unfold. The hunter arrives early. His cloak is heavy with dew. He stands apart from the others near the magistrate and priest, his expression unreadable. The woman has confessed. Her guilt has been sealed by signature and sermon, and now the ritual must be completed, not in darkness, but in daylight, not in secrecy, but in spectacle. This, too, is part of the doctrine. The execution is not just a punishment, it is a message, a warning, a performance meant to restore order, to remind the living of the price of heresy, of rebellion, of deviation. It is called justice, but it is laced with fear, raw, animal, communal fear that hums through the crowd like static before a storm. Children perch on their father's shoulders. Women clutch rosaries, their fingers moving silently over worn beads. A merchant whispers to his wife that this will be quick, but nothing about it is quick. The moments stretch. The air thickens. The accused is led forward barefoot, her hair unbound, her face pale with more than terror. The hunter does not look away. He cannot. This is his work made visible. This is the end point of the ritual, the inevitable outcome of the path he has walked. The woman is tied to the post. The wood beneath her feet is slick with morning moisture. The executioner, a local man chosen not for his skill but for his willingness, approaches with torch in hand. A priest begins the final prayer, his voice low, almost mournful. He speaks of salvation, of repentance, of fire as a cleansing flame, and then the flame takes hold. At first the smoke rises softly, curling into the air like incense. Then the fire crackles, then roars. Some in the crowd look away, some weep, some do not blink. The woman cries out, words that are lost in the heat, not curses, not confessions. Perhaps just a cry for her mother, perhaps only the involuntary sound of flesh meeting flame. The hunter stands motionless. He feels the heat against his cheeks, though he is not close. He watches because this is the final act, the confirmation. The proof that his work has meaning, but something inside him does not feel confirmed. Something feels stripped, emptied, broken, because it is not only her that burns, it is the story of her life. It is the last trace of her voice. It is whatever truth she held that will never now be known. Afterward, the crowd disperses slowly. Ashes settle over cobblestones. Children ask questions their parents do not answer. The square becomes once again a place of trade and passing feet, but the smoke lingers longer than the memory wishes to. The hunter retreats to the chapel. There is no celebration, only a quiet recording of the event in the tribunal log. Date, accused, confession, sentence carried out. And yet something remains, a taste in the air, a stain beneath the skin. He does not cry, he does not speak. He writes the next report with steady hands. But that night, as he kneels in prayer, he cannot recall the words, only the sound of burning wood, only the silence that followed. The days that follow an execution move slowly, as if the very air resists the turning of time. The village returns to its rhythms, but with a stiffness that was not there before. At the well, women draw water in silence. In the church, the prayers are softer, less certain. The smell of smoke has faded from the square, yet something remains, something that clings to walls and words, invisible but persistent. And the hunter, too, carries it. He does not speak of it. His duties continue. Another village awaits. Another rumor, another trail of signs and whispers. But his steps are heavier now, though his face remains composed. His hands perform the same gestures, writing, blessing, preparing, but with a subtle hesitation, as if each motion weighs more than it should. He dreams. At first the dreams are brief, flickers of fire, faces turned toward him in fear, but then they lengthen. In them, the voices of the accused speak plainly, without accusation, without pleading. They ask questions he cannot answer, not about their guilt, but about his certainty, about the moment he chose not to see them as people, but as proofs. He begins to delay his rituals. He prays longer, not for guidance, but for silence, for the dreams to stop, for the doubts to quiet. But the rituals that once gave him strength now echo with unfamiliarity. The words feel dry. The sacred texts blur beneath his eyes. Even the crucifix around his neck feels heavier, its shape no longer comforting, but cold. There are others like him, he learns. Men who began this path with fervor and ended it in silence. Some disappear entirely, retreating into monasteries or wandering from village to village, unrecognized and unclaimed. One such man, an older inquisitor with hollow eyes, once told him in passing, "The devil is not always the one screaming. Sometimes he is the one obeying." He had not understood then. Now he wonders. He begins to notice the children watching him, not with reverence, but with fear. He hears stories in hushed tones of villagers who vanished without confession, of bodies found not by decree but by accident, of innocents buried quietly, forgotten by the church but remembered by their kin. And most of all, he remembers the eyes of the woman on the pyre, not her cries, not her confession, just her eyes, locked on his, not in hatred but in something worse, recognition. He is not ready to abandon his role, not yet. But something within him has shifted. He questions the silences between words. He listens more carefully when the accused speak, searching not for guilt, but for something human. He delays sentences. He writes longer reports, filled with doubts rather than conclusions. His superiors notice, and they warn him. Mercy is not your task, they say. Obedience is. But obedience, once so solid, now feels like a kind of forgetting. He no longer walks with the same conviction. He begins to wonder not only about the guilt of the accused, but about the guilt that accumulates quietly in his own shadow. The kind that does not scream, the kind that watches, waits, and grows. And in that silent growth, he begins to understand something that the Malleus Maleficarum never taught. That evil does not always wear horns. Sometimes it wears robes, and sometimes it kneels at the foot of a burning stake, praying not for justice, but for sleep. To understand the hunter's place in this world, we must step back, away from the solitary figure before the fire, and look upward, into the machinery that guides his every move. He is not an island. He is a spoke in a wheel far older and more intricate than most can imagine. It is here, within the vast apparatus of the Inquisition, that his duty is shaped, protected, and demanded. The Holy Inquisition is not merely a tribunal of priests. It is a network, a lattice of authority that stretches across kingdoms, sanctioned by papal decree and reinforced by local rulers. At its heart lies a simple but devastating belief that heresy is a disease and the soul of the Church must be protected from infection at any cost. Within this system, every figure has a role. The inquisitor, often a Dominican friar, is the highest hand, tasked with spiritual authority and moral oversight. Below him, scribes and secretaries document each word, each confession, each sentence. Local authorities provide guards, transport, even executioners. And alongside them, in the shadows but ever present, walk the hunters, those who bring the whispers to the tribunal's door. Our hunter is one of many. He reports not only to God, but to men. He files regular reports, submits suspects for review, defends his findings in quiet rooms filled with parchment and incense. There are protocols to follow, procedures to honor. Every step must be validated. Every act must be cloaked in legitimacy, even when it leads to pain. The bureaucracy is immense. Letters must be sealed with ecclesiastical wax. Witnesses must be interviewed under oath. Torture must be approved, its use justified, recorded, and then preserved in archives that may never be read again. The language is formal, sterile. A woman is not a woman. She is the accused. Her cries are testimony. Her death is execution of the sentence. And so, in document after document, humanity is transformed into data. And yet, within this machine, there is room for ambition. Some climb through it, men who master the rhetoric of fear and faith, who know when to show mercy and when to condemn. They rise. They become respected, feared, protected. Our hunter sees them from afar. He hears their names in quiet conversations. Some have never questioned. Others once did, and silenced those doubts with titles. The machinery rewards certainty. It punishes hesitation, and so, as his doubts grow, he finds himself increasingly out of rhythm with the gears turning around him. His questions are met with polite correction, his concerns with distant eyes. One superior reminds him gently that God's mercy flows through judgment. Another warns that deviation from protocol may be seen as heresy in itself, and he understands. To question the machine is to stand in its path. The very structure that once gave him purpose now feels impenetrable. It is too large, too old, too rigid. And yet he cannot help but see its cracks, the quiet ways in which fear is leveraged, in which confessions are molded, in which power, cloaked in piety, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. Still, he does not flee. He continues his role, but more carefully now, more slowly. He writes longer reports, laden with caution. He seeks second testimonies. He delays where he can, stretching days into weeks. And in doing so, he walks a narrow line between loyalty and self-erasure. Because while the machine of the Inquisition moves forward without pause, he, its once faithful cog, begins to tremble beneath the weight of its relentless momentum. He sees now that the true danger lies not only in those it accuses, but in what it demands of those who serve it, and in how easily belief can be sharpened into a blade. She stands at the center of it all, yet remains unseen, not unseen in body, but in story, in memory, in dignity. She is the accused, always the accused, but before that she was a woman, and before that, a girl, and before that, a daughter, born into a world that already marked her body as suspect, her silence as secretive, her knowledge as dangerous. The hunter has come to know her well, though never personally. Her name changes from village to village, but her outline does not. Sometimes she is old, with joints bent by winters and work. Sometimes she is young, with eyes that do not lower quickly enough. Often she is neither, simply alone, widowed, childless, or too independent. She may be a healer, a midwife, a washerwoman, or simply poor. And always, she exists at the edges of things. Society, especially in small villages, draws lines that are invisible but sharp. Women who do not marry or who marry poorly. Women whose husbands die too soon or too often. Women who speak to themselves or to the trees. Women who know how to ease a fever, to soothe a womb, to end a pregnancy. These women become convenient containers for fear. They are the ones who cannot defend themselves, not because they are weak, but because their existence defies the simplicity the world demands. They are not witches, they are simply inconvenient. But the world is not kind to inconvenience. The hunter sees them now not just as suspects, but as patterns. The same faces again and again, shaped by different names. The same trembling hands, the same whispered pleas, the same histories of being slightly too much or not quite enough. And he begins to understand something the Malleus Maleficarum never confessed. That witchcraft, more often than not, is a name given to sorrow, a way of labeling the misfit, the mourner, the unclaimed. In one village, a woman is accused because she never attends Mass. She cannot, her legs are swollen with illness. In another, a girl is named because she smiled at a boy who later fell ill. Another is said to have cursed the baker's wife. Her only crime, she spoke against being overcharged. The community plays its part: jealous neighbors, spurned lovers, envious daughters-in-law. The church provides the language, but the village provides the reasons. And once accused, the woman is no longer herself. Her story is rewritten. Her laughter becomes suspicious. Her generosity becomes manipulation. Her solitude becomes unnatural. Even her silence becomes damning. The hunter sees this, and each time it grows harder to ignore. He remembers one woman who had nothing left to confess. Her children were gone. Her husband lost to war. She lived with a cat, and that was enough. Another, young and radiant, was denounced by 3 others, girls her age, afraid that her beauty meant favor and favor meant threat. These are not monsters. These are not witches. These are women caught in the web of fear and need. And still the machine moves. The hunter records. He questions. He observes. But now the questions linger long after they are spoken. The answers echo with more than guilt. They echo with loneliness. The accused do not scream of innocence because they know it is useless. They do not ask for proof because they know there is none to be had. They ask only for time, for mercy, for someone to remember who they were before the word witch stripped their name from them. And in the quiet after the interrogations, the hunter remembers their faces. He no longer prays for strength. He prays to remember, because the worst violence he now understands is not fire or rope. It is erasure, and it is done not only by flames, but by forgetting. In the dark recesses of the tribunal chamber, behind the ink-stained records and sanctified procedures, lies another truth, one spoken in hushed tones and hidden ledgers. It is the truth of profit, of gain masked as righteousness, of the quiet clinking of coins beneath the echo of prayers. The hunter had not seen it at first, or perhaps he had, and simply did not name it. He believed, as he was taught, that his work was spiritual, that the judgment he carried out was divine. But as time passed and the names grew, as the accusations flowed faster and the confessions came with fewer questions, a different pattern emerged, one not of faith, but of property. Each time a woman was condemned, her possessions were seized, her home, her land, her tools, her livestock. If she had no heirs, or if her heirs were also accused, those belongings passed not to the church directly, but through the hands of those who sanctioned her judgment. The inquisitor, the local magistrate, the cooperating priest, even the hunter. It was not presented as theft. It was the legal reward for service, a righteous redistribution, the wages of sin transformed into the wages of justice. But he began to notice things. A colleague with a new horse, though his stipend remained unchanged. A priest whose pantry swelled after a prosperous hunt. A tribunal that pressed for more names in wealthier parishes, yet showed restraint in poorer barren lands. It was subtle but pervasive, like mildew creeping along the base of a wall, unnoticed until it had eaten through the foundation. In one case, a woman was accused shortly after refusing a land sale to the bishop's cousin. Her fields, once hers, were reassigned before the ashes of her execution had cooled. In another, a midwife who owned rare medicinal herbs, ones worth silver in distant towns, was accused by her own apprentice. The apprentice married within the month, and the herbs were never seen again. These were not isolated misfortunes. They were symptoms of something deeply rooted. The system fed on itself. Accusations created confessions. Confessions justified executions. Executions freed up resources, and those resources, redistributed under the guise of divine punishment, quietly enriched those who kept the system alive. And so, fear became a currency. The hunter, though not rich, began to feel the touch of this current. He received gifts he did not ask for: a better room in the monastery, a fur cloak for the winter, wine at dinner. It was always explained away: gratitude, necessity, practicality. But he knew. Deep down, he knew. He tried to refuse them. But to do so was to question the structure itself, and he was not yet ready for that. Instead, he wrote it down, quietly in the margins of his private journals. He listed the names of the accused, the dates of their death, and what became of their possessions. Over time, a new kind of map emerged, not one of evil, but of opportunity, a cartography of injustice, and once seen, it could not be unseen. He realized then that faith, when mingled with power, creates not only obedience but appetite. And when that appetite is cloaked in sacred words, it feeds without shame. The fires of the Inquisition were not lit solely by fear. They were also fueled by desire, and in that smoke, souls disappeared, not just those of the accused, but of the ones who watched and said nothing, including his own, quietly, slowly, day by day, coin by coin. The room where the hunter now sits is quiet, filled with the scent of dried herbs and tallow candles. Scrolls and fragments of vellum clutter the table before him, records of ailments, planetary alignments, and strange symbols drawn in careful ink. Across from him sits a village herbalist, once suspected, now consulted, a woman of knowledge, neither fully trusted nor fully condemned. Her hands are stained with plants, her eyes tired, but alert. She speaks of cures, of balances, of seasons. He listens. Here, in this fragile pause, the hunter finds himself at a strange crossroads, between science and superstition, between reason and ritual, between what is known and what is feared. For centuries, the knowledge of the body, of healing, of the natural world, was passed not through universities but through experience, through women's hands, through observation, through whispered remedies, by candlelight. Yet as the fires of the Inquisition rose, so too did the fear of this knowledge. Anything not sanctioned by the Church, anything not explained through Scripture, was suspect, and thus the healer became the witch. He remembers how often he heard the phrase, "She knew too much." A woman who could bring down a fever with a poultice, a girl who could stop bleeding with a tincture of bark, a widow who knew which roots eased childbirth pains. Their skills, once valued, became dangerous when misunderstood or when feared. And alongside this suspicion ran a parallel belief system, a world of signs, omens, and tests. The devil's mark, they called it, a blemish, a mole, a scar that did not bleed when pierced. The floating trial, where the accused was thrown into water, and if she sank, she was innocent, though likely drowned. If she floated, she was guilty, and dragged back for questioning. The weight test, the needle, the incantation. None of these methods held truth, yet they offered something else, the illusion of control. Even among learned men, astrology was used to determine guilt. A woman born under a certain star was thought more susceptible to Satan's temptations. Lunar cycles were consulted. Comets were feared. The unknown was explained not through inquiry, but through ritual, and the hunter had believed it, had used it. He had once stood over a woman's bare skin, inspecting for marks with a trembling blade. He had held her under water until her limbs stopped thrashing. He had watched her float, bound and panicked, while villagers whispered prayers. He had called it justice. But now, as he sits across from this woman of plants and patience, he sees how easily fear had taken the place of knowledge, how the Inquisition's need for certainty had erased generations of understanding, how questions had been silenced in the name of purity. He thinks of all the things they never asked. Why did the fever rise? Why did the crop fail? Why did the child not cry? And instead of seeking the answers, they sought the guilty. Because answers were slow, complex, and often inconclusive. But guilt could be punished. The hunter's hand moves across the scrolls before him. He sees how the words twist, how one man's observation becomes another man's proof, how superstition, dressed in sacred language, becomes doctrine. And he realizes that the Inquisition feared not only witches, it feared knowledge. It feared the patient unraveling of mystery. It feared anything that could not be quickly labeled and burned. Outside, a storm brews. The wind howls low. The sky darkens not with magic, but with weather. And still the villagers close their shutters, whispering of curses and signs. The hunter does not correct them, not yet, but he writes, and in his writing, the silence begins to shift. The weight of unspoken truths presses harder than any accusation, and knowledge, once feared, begins to feel like a kind of salvation. The hunter walks the village path at dusk, the sun dipping low, casting long, quiet shadows across doorways and fences. Chickens rustle in their coops, a child coughs behind a shuttered window, and smoke curls steadily from chimneys as evening meals begin. On the surface, all seems still. But beneath this calm, there is a tremor. A thin, sharp wire of fear stretched taut through every household, every conversation, every glance. He feels it more now than ever before. Not just the fear of witches, but the fear of one another. When he first arrived in these villages, the people welcomed him not with joy, but with relief and suspicion woven into one. They offered names quickly, eagerly, as if to protect themselves by the sheer act of speaking. It is only now, years into his vocation, that the hunter begins to see the true cost of what his presence brings, not just to the accused, but to the community itself. Each accusation is a fracture. It does not begin with violence. It begins with a whisper, a side glance, a remembered insult, a sheep that died, a child that fell ill. And then someone says it aloud. Perhaps it was her. And once the words are spoken, they cannot be unsaid. Suspicion grows like mold in damp wood, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. Neighbors cease greeting one another. Families close their doors. A woman who once helped deliver a neighbor's child is now avoided on the path to the well. Bread is not shared. Milk is poured away. Eyes drop quickly. Every kindness becomes a potential threat. Every silence becomes a reason to suspect. The hunter sees how the villagers cling to him, not out of faith, but out of desperation. They need someone to blame. They need a shape for their suffering. A way to make sense of the misfortunes that fall like winter frost, unexpected and merciless. When he walks among them, he is not just a servant of the church. He is a vessel for their fear, a tool they wield with trembling hands, and yet they fear him too. He sees it in the way they speak, always cautiously, always just enough. No one wants to be too visible. No one wants to be remembered. He has become a mirror they do not wish to look into for too long. He remembers one village where 3 sisters lived alone after their parents died. They were kind, skilled at mending clothes and weaving wool. But when the eldest refused a marriage proposal, she was accused, and not long after, the younger 2 were as well. The hunter had questioned them, and though he found no true evidence, the pressure from the villagers was unrelenting. They had become symbols of disorder, of female defiance, of something that did not belong. By the time he left, their home was burned. No one claimed to know who set the fire. He knew, of course. Not the hand, but the motive, fear, envy, the instinct to survive. The community, once a tapestry of shared lives, becomes threadbare under the weight of suspicion. People learn to lie, to accuse before being accused. Children are taught to watch, to report, to avoid the strange, the poor, the unmarried. A kind of moral erosion sets in, one that no sermon can mend. And in the middle of it all stands the hunter, the man with the questions, the man with the authority to turn rumor into ruin. He begins to feel not like a protector, but like a fractured line drawn through the heart of each town he visits. And he begins to dread the sound of his own name, because the deeper the fear runs, the easier it becomes to follow, and the harder it becomes to find the way back. He walks now not with conviction, but with caution, because he knows that even in a crowd, even beneath the bells of the church, even with the authority of Rome at his back, he is utterly alone. The hunter had never questioned it, not at the beginning. It was simply a truth he absorbed like breath, that women were more susceptible to the devil. It was written in the Malleus Maleficarum, spoken from pulpits, whispered in monasteries. Women, they said, were more carnal, more fragile in spirit, more likely to be seduced into darkness. It was not personal, it was doctrine. But now, after years of fire, of confessions extracted, and lives reduced to ash, he begins to feel the weight of that belief, not as certainty, but as distortion. A distortion so complete it shaped an entire system of persecution around the image of a woman, not as a soul, but as a threat. He remembers their faces, not just the old and poor, but the young, the kind, the bold. He remembers one girl who dared to sing in the forest, one woman who chose to live alone after her husband's death, another who spoke several languages and kept books in her home. These were not witches. They were women who refused silence, women whose existence challenged the narrow scripts laid before them. He sees now how femininity itself was rewritten into accusation. A woman who showed desire was said to be possessed. A woman who refused a man's touch was said to be cursed. A woman who knew her body, who understood birth, blood, herbs, or pain, was said to have made a pact with Satan. He had once believed this was about good and evil. Now he wonders if it was about power and fear. Fear of women who could not be controlled. Fear of women who did not shrink. Fear of the body that gave life, that bled, that endured. The Inquisition taught him to read every sign, the bare foot on the earth, the whisper in the dark, the unbending gaze, as evidence of corruption. But now he wonders if they were simply echoes of freedom. And freedom in his world was dangerous. He begins to revisit the confessions with new eyes, the lines where women speak of Sabbaths and flight, of touching the devil's skin. These no longer read like facts. They read like stories forced upon them, stories shaped by the very questions he had asked, stories told to match the nightmare he was sent to find. And beneath those stories, another narrative emerges, one of pain, of resistance, of isolation. One woman confessed, then wept not for her life but for her daughter, because she knew the girl would now carry shame, suspicion, and silence for the rest of her days. Another spoke of dreams, not dark ones, but of running in open fields, of being seen, heard, believed. These were not demons, they were survivors, and he, who had once believed himself a warrior of God, begins to see himself as their jailer. The hunter no longer walks with certainty. He walks with ghosts, ghosts of women whose names were lost, whose lives were reduced to brief records in fading ink. He cannot save them, but he can remember them. He can name what he was taught to fear, and he can begin to unlearn it, not in sermons, not in law, but in silence, and in the slow, painful recognition of everything that was taken from them in the name of holiness. Time passes, but not all fires leave ash. Some leave stories, twisted, retold, reshaped, and in those stories the flames continue to burn. The hunter, now older, carries not just memory, but echoes. He has left behind the tribunal rooms and village paths, but he cannot leave the voices, and neither can the world. He begins to notice how the tales of witches remain long after the trials have ended. They shift form. They migrate into poems, paintings, sermons, songs. In taverns, men speak of witches with dark allure. In theaters, plays cast them as tempters, grotesques, or fools. In books, they become lessons for children, warnings against straying too far, wanting too much, or speaking too boldly. The witch, once a real woman bound and burned, becomes a symbol. And in that transformation, something is lost, and something else is preserved, because the stereotype remains: the crone in the woods, the beautiful seductress with poison in her kiss, the young girl whose curiosity unleashes ruin. All drawn from the same well of fear, all echoing the same logic that once justified ropes, flames, and silence. He begins to see her everywhere, not the accused, but the idea of her, in the paintings where she flies across moonlit skies, in the woodcuts where she cavorts with devils, in the ballads where her laughter leads men to madness, and always, beneath it, the same unspoken warning that a woman who is too free, too wise, too unyielding must surely be dangerous. It is not only in art. It is in superstition passed down through generations, in whispers that linger in small towns, in the instinct to distrust what cannot be easily explained. And though the bonfires no longer blaze in the village square, the suspicion smolders still in courts and pulpits, in homes. He realizes, with a quiet ache, that the legacy of the hunt is not only the names forgotten, it is also the fear that remains. He hears it in stories told to frighten daughters into silence. He sees it in how quickly a woman is blamed when things go wrong. He reads it in laws shaped not to protect, but to confine. And so the cultural inheritance is not a single artifact, but a shadow cast across centuries, a shadow shaped by centuries of punishment disguised as piety. He begins to write again, not confessions, but reflections, not sentences, but stories, not to accuse, but to remember, because remembrance, he now believes, is the only form of justice still possible. To speak of what happened, to name what was taken, to see in every twisted fairy tale, every painted devil, the faint outline of a real face, forgotten, but once breathing, once crying, once singing to herself in the dark. And if that song survives, it is because somewhere, even in silence, she refused to vanish completely, even under the weight of centuries, even under the weight of fire. The hunter sets down his pen. Outside, the wind moves through the trees. He listens for that song, hoping it might yet be heard. Among the many names etched into the grim history of witch hunting, few cast a longer or more chilling shadow than that of Matthew Hopkins. The hunter first heard it whispered in a cold stone hall far from England, spoken with a mix of admiration and dread. Hopkins, the so-called witch-finder general, operated not under the direct authority of the church, but with terrifying autonomy during one of England's darkest waves of persecution. To the hunter, weary from years of sanctioned fear and ritual cruelty, the story of Hopkins was both familiar and foreign. It revealed what could happen when zeal was left unbound by any ecclesiastical restraint, when belief in one's mission hardened into obsession. Matthew Hopkins emerged in the early 1640s during the English Civil War, a time when institutions were crumbling and communities were fraying under the strain of violence, famine, and religious division. Into this chaos stepped a man not trained by the Inquisition, not ordained by the church, but armed with conviction, a copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, and a chilling sense of purpose. Over the span of just a few years, Hopkins was responsible for the interrogation and execution of more than 100 women. He traveled from town to town with a small entourage, offering his services for a fee, bringing with him a familiar blend of rituals, suspicions, and instruments of extraction. His methods, though improvised, bore the familiar marks of the machinery the hunter himself once used: sleep deprivation, forced confession, public accusation. But Hopkins added something more. He performed. He transformed the witch hunt into a spectacle, leaning into the fear of the crowd, feeding it, shaping it. He drew confessions like a puppet master pulls strings, twisting pain into proof and hysteria into income. The hunter recognized too well how dangerous such theater could be, how easily it blurred truth and desire, justice and ambition. And yet, Hopkins did not meet his end in a blaze of judgment or excommunication. His death, quiet and ordinary, came not by fire but by illness, consumed by tuberculosis at the age of 27. No reckoning, no tribunal, only silence, and the lingering ash of those he condemned. For the hunter, this story is not a detour, but a mirror. Hopkins stands as a reflection of what he might have become had his doubts never surfaced, had he embraced power more completely, had he allowed his role to become identity. He sees in Hopkins not an outlier, but a warning of what happens when fear becomes enterprise and righteousness becomes a tool of destruction, unshackled from conscience. The tale of Hopkins haunts him not because of its scale, but because of its familiarity. It is the same story, played in a different tongue, beneath a different sky. A man convinced of his divine duty, a people desperate for order, a woman accused, and a fire, always the fire, waiting at the end. The hunter no longer wonders if he is different. He knows that he was not. He was simply slower to fall and slower to listen, to the silence that followed every scream, to the wind that carried names away like dust. He closes the Old English Chronicle, and in the quiet that follows, he offers no judgment, only the understanding that monstrosity often wears the face of the ordinary, and sometimes the voice of a savior. He no longer sleeps easily. The nights are long, and the fire, even when unlit, flickers in his thoughts. There are moments now, stretched between twilight and dawn, when he turns inward, not toward prayer, but reflection. He begins to ask not only about the women who suffered, but about the men who inflicted that suffering. Men like him. What does it take to become a witch hunter? Obedience, certainly, devotion, a belief so absolute that it leaves no room for doubt. But there is something more, something deeper, something more human and more dangerous. The hunter revisits his early years. He remembers how eager he had been to please, how proud he felt when first entrusted with sacred responsibility. He had followed orders, memorized scripture, studied the Malleus Maleficarum as if it were gospel. He was told witches were real, that they threatened the soul of Christendom, that it was his duty to protect the innocent by condemning the wicked. But what does such certainty require? It requires the silencing of empathy, the narrowing of vision, the ability to hear a scream and record it without flinching. It requires the transformation of doubt into heresy and of fear into fuel. And most of all, it requires belief not only in the system, but in oneself as the instrument of divine will. This is the psychology of the hunter. It is not born of sadism. It is born of structure, of authority, of being raised to see obedience as righteousness and disobedience as sin. In later years, the hunter begins to read texts that speak of these things, not theological texts, but writings from far-off lands, from thinkers who ponder the nature of cruelty, the fragility of conscience. They speak of how ordinary people, given power and purpose, can be led into atrocity. They speak of how systems mold individuals, of how the need to belong, to serve, to be correct, can override even the most basic human instinct for compassion. He recognizes himself in those pages, and he begins to see that the transformation into a hunter was not a moment, but a series of choices, each small, each seemingly justified, each rewarded by his superiors. He remembers the first time he witnessed torture and did not intervene. The first time he heard a lie and allowed it to become evidence. The first time he saw a woman weep and turned away. He had not been born a monster, but he had learned how to stop listening. And that silence had changed him. He writes these thoughts now alone, no longer a servant of the tribunal. He has stepped away, not publicly, not with protest, but quietly, like a man stepping out of a storm into an unfamiliar stillness. He does not seek absolution. He seeks only to understand how he became who he was. And in doing so, he comes to a conclusion both simple and unbearable. The worst atrocities are not committed by men who know they are evil. They are committed by men who believe they are right. And so the hunter, now only a man, turns inward, not with shame alone, but with a vow to never again act without listening, to never again believe without questioning, and to never again confuse silence with virtue. There are endings that come with fire, and there are endings that come with silence. The fall of the Inquisition, slow, uneven, reluctant, was not marked by revolt or revelation, but by fatigue, by the slow erosion of belief, by a world beginning to question what it once called sacred. The hunter, now aged and removed from the machinery he once served, watched it all unfold, not from the center, but from the margins. And it was in the margins that he began to understand how deeply history is shaped not just by events, but by the quiet shift of thought. The Enlightenment, they began to call it, a movement not of torches and tribunals, but of words, of pens, of ideas passed, hand to hand, challenging the structures that had stood unshaken for centuries. Men, and slowly women, began to ask dangerous questions. What is truth? What is justice? Who decides what is sacred, and why? Philosophers emerged who rejected the idea that fear should govern law, that pain could produce truth, that God required silence and fire. Courts began to turn away from accusations without proof. New systems of law emerged, ones that demanded evidence, allowed defense, and questioned the reliability of confessions wrenched from flesh. And as these ideas spread, the church, once untouchable, began to waver. Not immediately. There were still trials, still deaths, but fewer. And then, almost without ceremony, the fires began to fade. In Spain, in Italy, in Germany, the great engines of the Inquisition slowed. In some places, they were dissolved by decree. In others, they were allowed to wither. The buildings remained, but the echoes inside changed. The rooms grew quiet, the racks gathered dust, the scrolls yellowed. But silence, the hunter knew, does not mean peace, because even as the trials ended, the memory remained in the eyes of the descendants of the accused, in the fear that still clung to certain words, certain gestures, certain women, and within himself. He did not cheer the fall of the Inquisition. He did not celebrate. He only sat in stillness, feeling the weight of what had been lost, lives, names, truths, and the haunting knowledge that none of it had been undone, only halted. And yet, in the writings of the new thinkers, he found something unfamiliar and tentative: hope. Not a loud hope, not a triumphant one, but a quiet suggestion that truth could be pursued without violence. That belief did not require blindness. That justice might be something more than obedience. He kept a candle by his window in those years, not for prayer, not for penance, but as a reminder. That fire once used to destroy might one day be used to illuminate. And that perhaps, in the end, the greatest heresy had not been the witches at all, but the certainty that allowed their voices to be silenced. Long after the last stake was burned, the last cry stifled beneath the roar of fire, the question remained: how could so many ordinary men, priests and farmers, scribes and hunters, become participants in such cruelty? The hunter, now removed from the rituals and robes that once defined his days, turned inward, seeking not redemption but understanding. What made it possible? What allowed it all to seem not just acceptable, but necessary? In the quiet that followed, he began to read, not scripture, but philosophy. He discovered the writings of thinkers who had lived through other forms of darkness. They wrote of the banality of evil, of how horror is rarely the work of monsters, but of people who follow orders, people who keep records, light fires, close doors, and look away. People like him. And this, he realized, was the true terror of the witch hunts, not their violence, but their ordinariness. He had not been mad, nor had most of his peers. They were not sadists or fanatics. They were devout. They were certain. And that certainty had become their armor, their blindness. He thought often of the philosopher who wrote that the greatest crimes in history are committed not by men who hate, but by men who refuse to think, men who separate duty from consequence, men who mistake obedience for morality. The hunter had obeyed. He had believed that righteousness came from submission to authority, to tradition, to God. He had been taught not to question, but to act. And in that unquestioning silence, he had condemned dozens, perhaps more. And what of belief? Was it possible to believe deeply and still be wrong? He knew now that it was, that faith, untethered from compassion, could become a weapon. That truth, when handed down without room for doubt, could crush the very souls it claimed to save. He began to see the difference between law and justice, between purity and mercy, between silence and peace. And within those differences lay the thread of something fragile, something always at risk in any society: conscience. He thought, too, of power, of how easily it shifted, how quietly it seduced, how those who claimed to protect the innocent often found themselves punishing the vulnerable. How power, left unchecked, would always seek to justify itself, even at the cost of truth. And he thought of memory, of how the world forgets, not because it chooses to, but because forgetting is easier than facing the weight of what has been done, easier than acknowledging that those who burned the witches were not other but us. These reflections did not bring him peace. They brought him clarity, and in that clarity he found a task not of penance, but of presence, to remember, to listen, to speak when silence would be easier, to doubt when certainty demands obedience, and to carry forward not the legacy of the Inquisition, but its lesson, that any system which claims perfection without compassion will always find someone to burn. The hunter no longer wears robes. His hands, once ink-stained and calloused from endless writing, now tremble only when memory returns. And yet he knows what ended in the courts and dungeons did not die in the hearts of men. Fear remains. Not the fire fear of devils and witches, but a quieter fear, a fear that cloaks itself in modern words, a fear of the other, the strange, the different, a fear that still draws lines, still builds pyres, now metaphorical, but no less real. He walks through a marketplace in a town untouched by fire for generations. There is laughter, trade, music, but beneath it he sees echoes. He hears a woman called unnatural for raising her voice, a man shunned for speaking to spirits of nature. A child mocked for dreaming aloud. The shape of the fear has changed, but its root remains. He understands now that the witch hunts were not only about religion, they were about control, about who was allowed to speak, about who was believed, about who was seen as human and who was not. And this struggle, he knows, is not confined to the past. It rises whenever society feels threatened, when certainties are questioned, when borders blur, when power feels exposed. Then the whisper returns, it must be someone's fault. And in that whisper, the old instinct stirs to find the witch, to name her, to silence her. He reads the news from distant lands, places where people still disappear for thinking differently, for loving differently, for believing beyond the sanctioned walls. No fire, but exile, shame, poverty, mockery, systems built not to protect, but to erase. And so he writes again, not as a hunter, but as a witness. He writes to remind that fear, left unexamined, always finds new costumes. That suspicion, when fed by power, does not need chains or flame, only silence. He writes to remind that history does not repeat, it continues. And if we do not listen, if we do not see the trembling of the child who speaks alone, or the quiet resolve of the woman who refuses to bow, then we risk again becoming the hands that bind and the eyes that look away. The hunter closes his notebook. Outside, night has fallen. The stars shine not as omens, but as reminders that even in darkness, some things must be seen, even if only to remember that fear, unchallenged, becomes ritual, and ritual without mercy becomes fire. There is a church in the hills worn by wind and rain, its stones softened by centuries. No longer a place of judgment, it stands now in stillness. The hunter, now older than any record he once kept, visits this place not to seek forgiveness, but to remember. For even as the Inquisition fell into disuse, and even as the fires were extinguished, something deeper remained unspoken. The pain of the accused, the weight of the forgotten. And for generations, no one said their names. Their stories dissolved into footnotes and rumors, their humanity buried beneath the ash of righteous violence. But the world slowly began to turn. In quiet corners, historians began to uncover old trial records. Scholars transcribed the confessions not as facts, but as cries. Writers retold their lives with tenderness. Memorials were raised, a plaque in a village square, a statue in a garden, a circle of names carved into stone, open to the sky, and sometimes a letter, an apology issued by governments or churches acknowledging what had been done, not as error, but as cruelty made law. These acts, though symbolic, mattered. They did not undo the past, but they lit candles in its darkest rooms. The hunter read each one, eyes slow but steady. In one town, the descendants of an accused woman planted wildflowers where she had once lived. In another, the children were taught not only dates and names, but feelings, what it means to listen, to stand beside the unheard, to question the silence that power often demands. He did not attend these ceremonies, but he felt them, like a warmth returning to cold limbs. And yet, he knew, redemption is not a public act. It is a lifelong listening. It is found not in the rewriting of history, but in the refusal to forget. The memory of the accused is not sacred because they were perfect. It is sacred because they were human, and because they were made to suffer for who they were, not what they did. The hunter, in his final years, begins to speak their names, not aloud, not to crowds, but in prayer, not the old prayers of punishment and purity, but new ones, formed slowly from sorrow and humility. He remembers the girl who looked him in the eyes and did not plead, the woman who held her dignity until the rope was drawn, the child who confessed to dreams and was never seen again. And in each name he feels the quiet throb of history, not yet healed, but held. Because memory, like justice, is not a verdict. It is a vigil, one that must be kept, so that the fire does not return, so that the silence does not win, so that, even in death, they are not lost. Beneath the yellowed parchments of confessions and decrees, beneath the soot-stained testimonies and sacred signatures, lies an uncomfortable inheritance, one that has quietly shaped the modern world. The hunter, in the quiet years that follow his departure from the tribunal, begins to recognize it, the strange way that pain echoes not only in memory, but in law. He had once believed that what he did was lawful. He had the authority, the seal, the backing of the church. He followed procedure. And yet, it was precisely that structure which allowed injustice to breathe and expand, the absence of defense, the presumption of guilt, the use of pain to force truth, all dressed in robes of righteousness. And so, in the wake of centuries of silence, a question began to grow among those who studied law and philosophy in the emerging age of reason. How do we build justice without repeating the sins of the past? The answers came slowly, stitched together by revolt, reform, reflection. The presumption of innocence, this fragile, powerful idea that a person must not be condemned until guilt is proven, that silence is not admission, that humanity exists even in accusation. It was not born in a vacuum. It rose as a reaction to centuries of cruelty, to the tribunals that destroyed lives on the breath of rumor, the right to defense, to confront one's accuser, to speak without torture. These two are modern constructs with ancient roots, formed in part from the realization that unchecked belief in authority leads not to justice, but to silence. The hunter reads the writings of those who shaped these ideas, Montesquieu, Beccaria, Enlightenment voices that questioned power, that wrote of dignity, that demanded proof. Their words are firm, but not cold. They carry the weariness of those who have seen what law can become when it serves fear. And as these ideas spread, they reshape systems. Courtrooms no longer echo with screams, but with arguments. Judges weigh evidence, not rumors. The rights of the accused become sacred, not to protect guilt, but to preserve humanity. But the hunter knows that even these changes are fragile. He has seen how quickly fear can override principle, how a desperate community can abandon caution, how power, once questioned, always seeks to restore its reach. The law, he understands now, is not only about punishment, it is about restraint. It is a promise that even in the face of evil, real or imagined, we will not become what we fear. He walks through a small town where the courthouse stands on old ground. Beneath it lie the bones of those once tried in darkness. Above it, sunlight filters through windows carved with balanced scales. He places his hand on the stone. He does not pray, but he remembers. Because the foundations of justice are not only written in books, they are carved from the mistakes of those who came before. And in remembering those mistakes, not as distant horrors, but as human choices, he finds the faint outline of something sacred. Not purity, but possibility. Not perfection, but a vow to do better. There are voices that never had the chance to speak freely, whispers trapped beneath centuries of stone and smoke. The hunter, in the late years of his life, finds himself haunted not by the voices he heard, but by the ones that were silenced too soon. And so, slowly, he begins to read, not the edicts of bishops or manuals of doctrine, but the fragments left behind by the accused. Some survived. Letters written in secret, Testimonies copied by sympathetic scribes, words scratched into wood, sewn into hymns, hidden in prayer books. Not many, but enough. He holds them in his hands like relics. A young woman writes, "They asked me if I danced with the devil. I told them no. They twisted my arm until I said yes." Another, older, says only, "If I burn, let the truth outlive the flame." A girl, barely more than a child, writes to her mother, "I did not curse the crops. I only wanted to sing." These words are not defenses. They are echoes of a truth that refused to vanish. He learns of a woman named Maria who begged to be heard in her own language and was denied. Of a healer named Sabala who was punished not for failure, but for success. Of dozens who cried out not in rage, but in bewilderment, asking again and again, "Why me?" He does not have answers, but he reads, and in reading he listens, and in listening he begins to understand that the silence which followed their deaths was not natural. It was enforced by fear, by shame, by a culture that buried their memory because to remember was to face its own cruelty. In one village, he finds the story of a woman who, even under torture, refused to confess. "I will not give you names," she said, "because they are not witches. They are my sisters." She died nameless. But in a hidden corner of the church, scratched into stone, he finds her initials. He traces them with trembling fingers. He does not cry. There is no atonement in tears, only in remembering. He begins to speak their names in his journals as if calling them back from the margins. Not to undo their suffering, but to refuse their erasure, because history, he now knows, belongs not only to those who wrote it, but to those who endured it in silence. And their stories, though interrupted by rope, by fire, by shame, did not end. They linger in whispers, in trees that grew from ground soaked in their sorrow. And if he has any task left in this world, it is this, to carry their voices forward, to hold space where they were once erased. To let their names, once condemned, become a litany, not of fear, but of truth. The hunter, once feared and obeyed, now lives in a world that no longer calls his name, and perhaps that is how it should be. But in quiet rooms where young minds gather, in places filled not with incense but with chalk and pages, he senses a new kind of fire being lit, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Education, not the kind he once received steeped in dogma and fear, but something gentler, braver. A way of telling the truth, not to condemn, but to understand. He visits a school tucked between stone hills and forest paths. He sits at the back, unnoticed, listening to a teacher speak. She tells of the witch hunts not with cruelty, but with care. She names the women who were silenced. She explains the laws that allowed their persecution. She asks the students not to memorize dates, but to feel, to wonder, to imagine. And the children listen. One girl asks, "Why didn't anyone stop it?" The teacher pauses, then says, "Because no one taught them how." The hunter bows his head. In this room, there are no stakes, no chains. But there is power. Power in the act of remembering truthfully, of refusing the comforting half-versions passed down by fear. Power in saying out loud what once could not be spoken. He watches as the students learn about the roots of prejudice, about how fear is taught and how it can be unlearned, about how justice is not inherited but practiced, about how history must not be smoothed into heroism but held in all its jagged pain. In one book, he finds a passage written not by a scholar but by a survivor's descendant. We do not teach this to shame. We teach it so that no girl is ever feared for being bold, so that no voice is ever lost in the name of purity. He closes the book slowly. In these classrooms, he begins to see what he once could not imagine, that the antidote to fear is not silence. It is knowledge. It is curiosity without cruelty. It is compassion shaped into curriculum, and in that there is a promise, not that history will never repeat, but that someone will see it coming. He walks through the schoolyard where laughter spills freely. No one knows who he once was, but perhaps one day they will know what was once done. And in knowing, they will choose differently, not because they are better, but because they were taught. Even as the hunter steps into the twilight of his life, he is aware that the stories never truly ended. They changed their form. The fire no longer burns in village squares, but on cinema screens. The trials are not spoken in Latin, but scripted in dialogue. And the witch, once a figure of fear and scapegoating, now walks the pages and stages of popular culture, reshaped for new eyes. He watches from the quiet of a corner chair as the world tells its stories again. In films like The Witch, he sees the tension between freedom and repression, between wildness and control. He recognizes the haunted silences, the suspicion that spreads like smoke, the desperation of those who are different simply by existing. It is not history, but it breathes from it. He sees The Crucible, where Arthur Miller's Salem is not only a stage of persecution, but a mirror held up to modern fears. In its lines, the hunter hears the same hunger for order, the same manipulation of truth, the same panic that demands victims. And even in fantastical worlds, where wands are wielded and spells are spoken, he senses the deeper echoes. In the whisper of mudblood, in the chambers hidden beneath castles, in the exile of characters for the danger of what they are rather than what they have done, he recognizes the old architecture of suspicion. The witch, he realizes, has become more than a villain. She has become metaphor of otherness, of resistance, of knowledge denied. Sometimes she is reclaimed, no longer feared, but admired, even envied. She is the symbol of power that is feminine, mystical, untamed. And though this glamorization may blur the brutal reality of those once accused, it also speaks to something healing, a desire to transform pain into voice. He does not criticize these stories. He watches them with a strange reverence. Not because they are historically precise, but because they carry a pulse, a memory embedded in fiction. He understands, too, that these retellings are part of what culture does. It processes trauma through metaphor. It holds mirrors not to the past, but to the present. And in the figure of the witch, it asks us again and again, who do we fear and why? He walks through a bookstore, fingers tracing spines of novels, memoirs, scripts. He sees covers that shimmer with magic and others that show women bound, burning, screaming into silence. The contrast stings, but it also opens a path, because even in entertainment, a question is being asked. Even in fantasy, truth lingers. And if the young grow up seeing the witch not as a monster, but as a mirror, perhaps they will learn not to build the next pyre. Perhaps they will ask not who is dangerous, but who is being silenced. And perhaps in the flicker of a screen or the turning of a page, they will remember. That history hides not just in archives, but in stories, and in the choice to tell them differently. There are roles that isolate by nature, and then there are those that isolate by consequence. The hunter, long after the fires dimmed and the parchments faded, began to understand the peculiar solitude of the executioner, not the man who lit the fire, but the one who named the condemned. It was never easy, even in the beginning. Communities feared him as much as they called upon him. He was greeted with dread and suspicion, with bowed heads and locked doors. No child smiled freely in his presence. No mother looked him in the eye unless forced. He was invited to meals, but never to laughter. He was necessary, but he was never loved. He remembers the silence after a trial, how even those who supported his decisions avoided his gaze. How the same villagers who offered whispers of accusation in private could barely meet him at the altar. After sentence was passed, his presence reminded them of what they were capable of when afraid. There were no friendships that lasted, no bonds that grew beyond duty. Even among fellow inquisitors, the relationships were stiff, built on rules and reporting, not warmth. And though he served a sacred institution, it offered little comfort once the day's work was done. He carried the loneliness home. It lived with him, in the way he ate, in the way he prayed, in the way he aged. And as years passed, he noticed how his name disappeared from casual mention. The villagers he once visited moved on. The archives that recorded his work did not speak of the man, only the cases. The world forgot him, except in fear. There were rumors, of course, that he was cursed, that no woman could stay with him, that his sleep was broken by the screams of those he condemned. Perhaps some were true. Perhaps the silence he bore was louder than any memory. He tried once to return to ordinary life, to walk through markets like any other man, to nod at strangers without being recognized. But something about his presence, his posture, his quiet, marked him, not as a man of God, but as someone who had stood too close to the fire. The paradox was cruel. He had been told his work was holy. He had been taught it was necessary. And yet it was that very work that left him untouchable. He became a man between worlds, not entirely part of the church, nor of the village, nor of the future that rose after the flames. A man whose silence was once obedience, and later shame. Now, in his final years, he walks paths alone, not because he must, but because he knows how easily trust fractures under the weight of what he once called duty. And though he is no longer feared, he is not embraced. He has become the shadow of his own legacy, and he understands at last that those who serve systems of judgment often find themselves judged not by law, but by memory. And in memory there is no robe thick enough to hide a life spent setting fires. The fire no longer burns in the town square. The ropes have frayed. The tribunal benches sit covered in dust. But memory, as always, smolders quietly. And in that smoke, sometimes, the hunter sees himself, not as he was, but as he might have been seen by others. There came a time, not sudden but creeping, when suspicion turned inward. The same system that once empowered him began to regard him with a cooler eye. Questions were asked, not of the women he had accused, but of his methods, his motives, his records. Whispers followed him down hallways once lined with reverence. It was not unexpected. He had seen it before. Other hunters brought low by the same fear they once wielded, men accused of corruption, of heresy, of leniency, or of something worse, doubt. He remembers one colleague, a man of fierce conviction, who vanished after being accused of withholding a confession. Another, younger, was said to have taken bribes. Neither was ever seen again. The machinery they had once turned swiftly against them. Because the system, built on absolute authority, could not tolerate cracks, and those who hesitated became suspect. The hunter felt it first in the way letters arrived later, in the reassignment of cases, in the absence of invitations, and then one day a summons, not to testify, to be examined. The questions he once asked now turned back on him. Had he followed every step? Had he consulted the right authorities? Had he ever protected an accused woman? Had he ever doubted? He answered carefully, with honesty, but not with confession, because he knew. Once the questions begin, they do not stop. He was not condemned, not formally, but he was no longer called. His records were not reprinted. His final reports were left unsigned. He became officially unnecessary, and in that redundancy he saw the irony. That the hunter, trained to pursue shadows, had become one, not by rebellion, but by fatigue, not by guilt, but by humanity. He left quietly. Others took his place, younger, eager, certain. He watched from a distance as they repeated the rituals. The process continued even as the world changed. But he never forgot the final irony, that the system devours its own, that the fire, once lit, does not discriminate, and that in a world built on suspicion no one is safe, not even the obedient, not even the faithful, not even the hunter. And so, as the sun sets behind his last home, he closes his eyes and wonders not who was right, but how many lives were lost before anyone dared ask. What if we were wrong? The hunter's story ends not with a scream nor with a flame, but with silence. A silence filled not with peace, but with the echo of footsteps walked in darkness. His hands, once instruments of judgment, now tremble with age. Not from guilt alone, but from the weight of what was never questioned until it was too late. He no longer seeks answers, he seeks remembrance. And in the quiet of his final days, he returns once more to the beginning, not to the church or the court, but to the faces. The girl who sang too loudly, the widow who healed too gently, the child who dreamed too strangely. They return to him not as ghosts, but as reminders. That history is not made by grand declarations, it is made by small decisions. By the turning of a key, the nod to proceed, the silence after an accusation. He understands now that his life was not just shaped by belief, but by the absence of doubt. That faith, unexamined, became a blade. That fear, institutionalized, became doctrine. That the names lost to fire were not lost to the devil, but to the desperation of those who needed someone to blame. The hunter no longer writes. He walks, slowly, carefully, through fields once salted by suspicion, now overgrown. He sees children play where once silence reigned, and he wonders, not what he could have done, but what we still do, because though the rituals change, the hunger remains, the need to purify, to punish, to name the strange and call it evil. He closes his eyes beneath the same sky that once burned with pyres, and in its cold stillness he whispers what no one dared speak in the heat of the hunt. I was wrong. And with that, his story settles into ash. A story not only of judgment, but of awakening, a reminder that the fire may die, but the warmth of memory can keep its lessons alive. If this silent descent into the past, the loneliness, the confusion, the fading humanity of a man who once believed he served the divine has touched you, I would be deeply grateful if you would offer me a silent click on the like button and perhaps subscribe for more winding explorations through the haunting and intricate corridors of history. Until next time. Good night and sweet dreams.